Hello there, folks, and welcome back once again to Southbank Live, our weekly live YouTube broadcast where we discuss some of the news and market events that have taken place over the past week and dive a little deeper into what is driving them behind the scenes. My name is Boaz Shoshan, and I'm joined once again by John Butler. John, how are you getting on this week?
Oh, very well. How about you?
Pretty good, pretty good. I'm in Barcelona at the minute, so I've dodged some of the issues plaguing the public infrastructure in the UK, something that we shall be discussing in this episode. Good evening to everybody who has tuned in. Do feel free to leave any comments that you would like, any questions you'd like answered in the chat. Good evening to Andrew and AJ, who are first off as ever. Great to see you guys there once on. In terms of the markets this week, we could talk for hours. There's no shortage of content. But just to start us off with, have you got a long and a short for us this week?
Yes, I do. And it is a variation on some things I've discussed before. And it actually relates very directly to some of this week's bigger headlines. And the long is basically energy and basic industries. I've highlighted this before. I've pointed out how useful these industries are to the economy, no matter how screwed up it is, right? Whether you're in growth, whether you're in recession, you might not be building new machines, but you still got to fuel those machines with energy. And of course, you've got to provide maintenance on the existing capital stock, which does require spare parts and things that do, you still have to be pulling stuff out of the ground is my point. And so I won't say that energy and basic industries are recession proof, far from it, but they at least tend to maintain stable profit margins, even in challenging environments. And when you get into stagflation, stable profit margins are absolutely what you want.
Yep.
And so, yes. And so when I see headlines such as European countries turning the coal mining back on and turning the coal plants back on, this is really a sign of the times now. We're into a situation where basic energy needs, basic materials, basic mining, basic industries generally, they're going to do okay. It's a relatively safe place to hide vis-a-vis all the high flying stuff that held so much promise for so long. Be it green energy, be it certain forms of tech, be it, whatever, next new thing was being proffered. And so it's just yet another example of falling back to what simply works. And I think we're going to remain in this sort of environment for a long time. It's not just the Ukraine war. We know there were problems with various forms of infrastructure before the Ukraine war kicked off. So this is just making a big problem worse. So anyway, that's my long. And my short is still the US dollar. When I look at the charts, when I look at the way the US dollar is trading versus other major currencies, it really looks like it wants to reverse here. My fundamental view is that it should and probably should have done already, but for the Fed being relatively hawkish in recent weeks, that's held things up. But the whipsaw volatility we're seeing and the chart patterns that I'm seeing, I think the timing's about right. I think the dollar is going to correct lower very soon now and into something that becomes a material downtrend.
Yeah, it does make you wonder how long this dollar strength can persist given the current environment. Plenty of different angles on that, of course, with the dollar status as global reserve currency. I think for my long and short this week, the reason I'm actually in Barcelona in the first place is for the Solana Hacker House. They're doing these things where you go there, pick up a lot of merch, and everybody develops lots of applications on it. Solana have just announced just a few minutes ago that they're building their own mobile phone, which is very, very cool as well. So I think I'll be long on Solana, though of course I am a little biased as I'm in the crypto space now. And in terms of my short, this actually comes to our very first headline of the evening that I'd like us to discuss. My short is the working week. I'm thinking it's going down, guys. I think we should be very short on that. John, we've discussed all of these different aspects of the 1970s coming back with stagflation. Organized labor is not something that a lot of people expected, but it's something that I think you and I have both been talking about for some time. What's your take on the current issue with strikes in the UK? Because everyone thinks that this is just going to go away again. I think this is something we're going to see persist for quite some time this decade.
Sadly, I think it probably will. Look, the fact is that the UK has been following what, in my opinion, is a generally inflationary economic policy set for years. Now, there was a time, if you want to go all the way back to the 1990s and 2000s, there was a time when the integration of the Chinese, the Indian, and some other emerging market economies was bringing in a whole new labor force that was receiving all kinds of new capital investment to make that new labor force more productive. That was a benign disinflationary shock, a prolonged one for the global economy, including, of course, Great Britain. That's sort of gone away now. The fact is that you've seen a lot of this integration take place. You've seen a lot of this emerging market labor become skilled workers, and they're paid halfway decent wages now. Don't get me wrong, they're not paid as much as we are in the developed world, but the gap has closed a great deal. And and these labor markets are somewhat more mature. And and if they're facing higher food and energy prices, and that's where the world's manufacturing base now is, some of that's going to get passed through into exports, and those exports are going to arrive in the UK, and they're simply going to be more expensive. The fact is, this benign environment, global environment, is over. The UK was a huge beneficiary of it, and now the UK kind of has to stand on its own. And yet, it has still been following a highly inflationary set of macroeconomic policies in recent years, including, of course, COVID lockdowns, which severely constrained domestic supply. And yet, they tried to support demand with spending of all kinds. That's inflationary. That's inflationary, and we're seeing the lagged effects of that now too. So you put it all together, and I think we're in an environment where strikes, sadly, are going to become widespread and persistent as the working class in the UK realizes that the cost of living really, really, really is squeezing them in a way they've probably, in some cases, never been squeezed in their working lifetimes. They might have vague memories as being children when some of this stuff unfolded, and they're still of working age today. But they wouldn't themselves have been taking home paychecks that in real purchasing power terms were clearly getting much, much lower in a very short period of time. That changes your psychology. So you've got a whole generation now that for the first time has a right in their face reason to demand higher pay. And that's a recipe for strikes, especially in some industries where it's easier to strike than others because of natural monopolies and lack of competition and things like this. So, in my opinion, this is just getting going. I think it's extremely hard for the government to say you can only get whatever it is, a 3 or 5% pay rise when the headline inflation rate is closer to 10%. That's a difficult position for the government to defend. So anyway, I think this is a long way to go.
Yeah, sadly, it's all kicking off again. There was an article in the Times that I was reading the other day that where somebody was saying, you think these strikes are bad? Back in my day, that we had really bad strikes, and I was like, just give it a few years, man. We'll get right back there, all in good time, all in good time. Wishing a very good evening to HK Huri, Ian, and Dave, and Barry, and indeed to Rune. If you do have a long and a short that you would like to submit for this show, do let us know in the comments, as there's always amusing to see what people come up with. John, just to get into another angle of this, so we've got all of this chaos here in the UK. I was thinking of what's going on in Europe as very interesting too. We did discuss this a bit last episode. And in your own words, you said it looks like Europe is fracturing. And there's a couple of headlines I'd like to take a look at here, which somewhat suggest this, both of them from the FT again. Electoral breakthrough puts far-right leader Marine Le Pen back in the game. And then over in Bulgaria, the Bulgarian government crisis opens door to pro-Russian hard right. Now, John, you take a very close look at this, and there is, of course, so much strain that is inside the Eurozone at the minute and the EU ecosystem as a whole. What is going on in these areas that is worthy of discussion, and what are the causes here? Because everyone's going to run a blame game, and there's going to be a lot of aspersions cast. What is going on?
Well, first of all, populism in Europe has been on the rise for years. And it's been on the rise for years. It didn't necessarily have enough momentum early on to really get very far. But in the last few years now, I mean, it's really been rising a lot. Now, obviously, the UK is kind of a special case with Brexit and all of that. But if we get to the continent, it's hard to find a country where populist parties have not gained voting share quite materially now. And of course, in France, it's got to the point where the National Front holds enough votes in the parliament to effectively block uh, whatever they want to block. Now, France does have a presidential system, and it does matter what Macron wants to get done. But there's lots of kinds of legislation in France that still need to go through the parliament. And now you've got this huge voting bloc controlled by the populist Marie Le Pen's populist party. So there's that. Obviously, in Italy, you've got Cinque Stelle and the northern. Anyway, you've got various populist parties in Italy that have been doing well for a while, and it's starting to show up pretty much everywhere. Why? Well, look, obviously, this is the long-term legacy of the global financial crisis, which of course led to the European banking crisis, which led to austerity, which led to the run on Greek banks, which led to all kinds of other stuff. And the problem is this, right? Things in Europe really haven't gotten any better. I mean, there's no sense they're making any progress. And so now all of a sudden you're faced with this huge surge in inflation, which adds insult to injury. And so populism is only going to get a greater push, in my opinion, from this. And so these sorts of headlines where you get parties that fine, call them far right if you want, or far left, or whatever you want to call them, getting very dramatic increases in voting share. I think that's going to continue over the next couple of years. It's going to make countries very hard to govern. And in some cases, the populists may actually seize control. And you mentioned Bulgaria now in that headline. Now, that's an interesting one. I mean, keep in mind, Bulgaria has never really had much of a Western orientation at all. Okay. This country has been not necessarily outright allied with Russia or the Russian Empire, but it was certainly part of the Soviet bloc. But it's always had very, very strong sympathies in that direction, and its willingness to join the EU and to consider adopting the euro is really a historical aberration, right? It really, really is. It's not the sort of what you would expect, and indeed, you also see Bulgarians rejecting now the move to join the euro. They don't want to do it. They see what's happening in the euro area, and they actually think, no, we think we should retain our independence to some extent. And indeed, really, I mean, being caught between East and West, but traditionally being more East than West, it wouldn't surprise me at all if populist pro-Russia politicians started building their voting share in Bulgaria. So yes, Europe is fracturing. It's fractioning north-south, and it's actually also fractioning some a bit east-west. And I think this process has much farther to run at the rate things are going.
When you're thinking of what we might see next in that process, where are the flashpoints? Like, what is a area of the economy, for example, like energy, which we'll come on to in a bit?
Yeah, it's huge.
Right. Where do you think
the immediate issues really are the ones that are directly impacted by the Ukraine war, and energy is front and center. Obviously, right? The fact is, different EU members are following different strategies to try to solve their various energy crises that in some cases already existed around the margins, but have really, really been exacerbated by the Ukraine war. And so you see countries like Hungary that didn't blink an eye before they cut a deal with Russia to make sure that gas kept flowing, right? But you have other countries like Germany that have only reluctantly done that and are already trying to find alternatives, knowing it will take time to bring alternative supply online, but they're certainly trying to wean themselves off their current dependence on Russian gas. So everyone's kind of coming up with their own way to solve their own problems. And in some cases, the solutions aren't going to work, at least not well enough for the electorate. Energy will be too expensive, too unavailable. There might be blackouts now and again. God forbid that happens in winter when things are properly cold. Stuff like that has political consequences. And I suspect that's the immediate issue. Slightly more medium term, although it might not take too long, is the fact that some European countries, inflation is less of an issue with respect to the euro than others. Some countries like Germany, hey, I mean, the euro, you always had your euro skeptics in Germany, and you had the issue, the cases brought before the German Constitutional Court arguing that what the ECB is doing is clearly unconstitutional, violates both the Maastricht Treaty and the German Basic Law, the Constitution of Germany. So you're going to start to see that also. Some countries are going to really say, no, we can't, we don't like what the ECB is doing. Other countries are going to kind of shrug and say, well, no big deal, because it's financing our huge government deficits and debt. So that's a little bit more medium term. And yet, again, it could accelerate because inflation is so elevated now.
Yeah, every country solving their own problems in their own ways doesn't sound very pro-Euro to me,
No,
John. I thought there was a different strategy. How much pushback do you think the technocrats inside the Eurozone can exert on these countries that act out in such a manner?
Well, they can try to punish the net recipients of EU aid. I mean, the EU budget is not small. I mean, that said, relative to national budgets, it is. But it's still meaningful for a lot of the smaller recipients of EU aid, and they can threaten to pull that, right? They can say, well, we're not going to finish building that motorway or whatever other infrastructure project it might be that was receiving a substantial amount of EU funding. So they can threaten things like that. The problem is in politics, especially when you already got a rise of populism, people don't like being bullied. It's one thing to receive money when you kind of buy into the project, but if you're starting to not as fully buy into the project, you might say, "Well, to hell with it. We don't need your money." You'll get some of that reaction from some of these people, and indeed, I believe rhetoric to that effect has already been forthcoming from Hungary, and I think to a lesser extent by a handful of other historically quite neutral Eastern EU member states.
I think ties in well with the next headline I'd like to share, which is regarding the energy issues inside the Eurozone, and of course the technocrats saying, no, we can't be using coal. This wasn't the idea. So this is from the Financial Times again. EU warns against fossil fuel backsliding as coal replaces Russian gas. Once again, John, tying back into what you said earlier regarding green energy, maybe having had a bit of a heyday, and now we're entering quite a different situation. Like, just going back to that sort of top-down EU structure, we're doing renewables, and we're going to make the decisions. Contrasting very strongly with, well, we don't want blackouts and we want to have hot showers during the winter. Like, where do you think this kind of comes to a head? Because and maybe it doesn't come to a head in one specific spot. Maybe I'm thinking about it too simply, John. But is there any place I should be looking, or any time I should be looking, other than simply winter, for where this causes a serious rift, a very noticeable, visible one inside the Eurozone?
Well, winter's obvious. I mean, there's going to be some seasonality here for sure, right? However, winter or no, given the number of EU member states there are, it's almost, in my opinion, it's almost inevitable that at least one, if not a couple, reach a point, which again could be in winter, but it doesn't strictly have to be, when the domestic politics are such that it's just clear that the priority is keeping the lights on and not caving to Brussels' demands. And again, there are so many countries involved. There are so many. And I'm hardly an expert in all of them, right? In fact, I'm not really an expert in any. I kind of follow what I can follow, as it were, right? And there's too many of them, right? You can't keep all of these people happy. There's no one size fits all renewable energy policy that's going to come from Brussels. They're going to take things into their own hand. Brussels will push back, threatening to withdraw this or that aid or whatever. And fine, some countries might say, okay, fine, we won't go there. But a couple of them probably will. And then when their neighbors see that, that country's lights are on, but they're not on in our country, they might realize that their domestic voter base, which is well aware that, our friends across the border here have their hot showers this winter, that'll become a real problem. So you only need a couple examples. In a way, psychologically, it's not dissimilar to Brexit. And you can't tell me that there aren't, significant voter groups in several European countries who look at what Britain has done, with Brexit and think, gee, if we accumulate more power in the next election or whatever it is, we might push for a renegotiation of our relationship with the EU. We might not leave entirely necessarily, but we're certainly going to expect a certain greater degree of independence in certain matters. That to me is almost inevitable. It won't happen everywhere, but it could happen in quite a few countries, given what I see with all these underlying fracturing trends.
Certainly. We have Stephen in the chat saying Brexit was the best move we made in decades. I just wish they would complete it, which is, well, I think we all we all wish that to some degree. And we also have, I believe there was another comment here regarding the Brexit question. I think it's from Apex Cypher. When the euro goes bang, Brexit will be called the Great Escape. Very interesting scenario that we've got here. And Apex Cypher also commenting, Lagarde and von der Leyen haven't got a clue what they're doing. It won't end well. They don't. I think even if they did know what they're doing, there's only so much that they can do in their position in this environment, right? You've got to you're in a very reactive position. I don't think there's much you can really bring to the table other than react well to all of the issues that we are now going to see take place. Am I thinking about that in the right way, John?
I think so. I don't think the EU is an institution that is really capable of solving the sorts of problems that have now bubbled up. And look, the fact is, Europe again has been running like the UK. Europe has been running generally inflationary policies for a long time. All the talk of austerity, it was ever only relative austerity. Please show me one European country that outright ran surpluses in the wake of the global financial crisis. Name one. Right? There isn't one. Okay. True austerity, true belt tightening is not always adding to your debt burden. Okay. So don't get me wrong. I mean, clearly the deficits did shrink in size, but they were still deficits. And then, of course, they absolutely went through the roof when COVID showed up. And now that you have the various shocks associated with the Ukraine war, they're only going to go up even more. So, look, what can the EU really do about it? Also, the EU lacks proper, hard diplomatic or military power. The EU cannot pick up the phone and speak to Putin, even if they wanted to. His secretary will reply, who is he supposed to speak to? Who actually makes decisions here? And they'll be like, there's this process that even we don't fully understand. You see what I'm getting at? So they can't really do that. They can't offer to help solve this conflict in any meaningful way. Hence why you see the headlines around, Macron making an effort now and again, Germany possibly making an effort now and again to gain some sort of diplomatic initiative to see if there's some sort of way to work this out. You really don't see the Eurocrats going there because they have no power to do so.
Yeah, the EU has talked a big game regarding strategic autonomy for several years, but it's never been backed up by anything. It's always speaking about, in the future we're going to have this, prepare for this. But the crisis is here, and you've not got it.
No, I mean, it's kind of funny because yes, all this talk about a European superstate's been going on for a long time, and you got all these visionary folks who who are frustrated that we haven't got there already, but they still assert, but someday this is only natural. It's definitely going to happen, inevitable, and we got to stick with it. And the funny thing is that if you ask me, the whole concept of European superstate is now severely in question. Do people even want it? And if they wanted it, is it practicable? It might in the face of the exigencies of reality. Is this really the institution that best serves all these member states? I think a lot of people can scratch their heads now and begin to wonder, whether the EU has already gone too far. Should we be more of a trading bloc? Should we cooperate more in strictly commercial matters? Anyway, it might go on and on and on, right? So, anyway, that's where we are, and this is the thing. Not that anyone's in a good situation here, but you could argue that amongst major institutions worldwide, the one whose existence, at least as it is structured today, is most threatened is the European Union.
Certainly doesn't seem like a good place to be. Though I'm sure the pension benefits are very good indeed. If you can retire out of it, I'm sure it is a good place to be. But right now, if you are working for the EU in a senior position, you've got an awful lot of problems that you're going to have to deal with. And one wonders how they will be rectified. I do wonder, John, what do you think? If, post-Brexit 2016, you had all the people dressing up in EU flags all over the place, parading around. I remember superhero costumes and whatever with the star-spangled EU flag and whatnot. I mean, do you think they're in such a high population as they were, or do you think some people maybe started to maybe this wasn't such a good idea? I don't know.
It's hard to know. It's hard to know because it seems to me you have different types of people who are pro EU with respect to Brexit specifically. Some of them took what they thought was, a very sober look at the raw economics of it and thought it was simply a bad idea, right? That it was better for Britain economically to be in this trading bloc of the EU. Others, however, are more ideological about it. They think that the only way to prevent another European war is the EU, and leaving it raises the possibility of war and all kinds of other horrible things that have happened in Europe's history. And you're not going to be able, these ideological people are not going to change their mind just because of what's happening now, right? They're going to stick with this idea that an EU superstate is absolutely positively the best possible future for Europe. So they're not going to change their minds. But those who look at the specific politics, the specific economics, the challenges from the East, the North-South divide, and various other things, may be a bit more open-minded. That perhaps, we need to recognize that Europe actually is a somewhat diverse continent. One size doesn't necessarily fit all, and we should respect a certain degree of national autonomy here as just the natural state of affairs. And does that mean it has to lead to war? Of course not. So these are the sorts of people who might, under circumstances such as these, consider changing their mind.
Quite possibly. Some very interesting long and shorts in the chat, folks. Do welcome them every week. Rune is long on Merseyrail staff. They managed to get the 7% pay rise. Well done. And short is Macron. To which Gerald says, you can't get shorter than Macron. Always a nice bit of frog bashing in the chat. Of course, we don't mind anything about French. It's just funny. John T says, Europe does look as though it's becoming fractured. Merkel held it together. Will it cave in around Macron? And that Brexit brings the only stability to this world. Now, I'm not sure about that, John. I think maybe I'd probably replace that with gold brings the only stability to this world. That's just me. But on that note, Merkel held the EU together. Will it cave in around Macron? Interesting claim. I mean, I would, from my side, John T., I would say if Merkel was still in power today, she wouldn't be holding it together because all the problems that arose during her reign are now just coming home to roost, and she's managed to leave and then write some interesting content in the Financial Times saying, no, I didn't actually make any mistakes. I'm not apologizing for anything. Around Macron, though, yeah, what do you think, John? Is Macron going to be the guy carrying the can for Europe?
Well, he certainly could try. The fact is, right, that France, as I mentioned earlier, does have a presidential system. The French president is more powerful in domestic politics anyway than the German chancellor. And because France has a substantial military, which in operational terms, actually in many ways is more capable than the German military, right? when it comes to foreign policy and the possible role of the military in foreign policy, France has that going for it too. And this particular coalition in Germany that has formed is pretty weak and fragile, if you ask me, compared to what Merkel was able to deal with. And indeed, Merkel used what was a more solid coalition behind her governments to gently nudge the German center a little bit to the left and maintain, nevertheless, enough support of the right in doing so. And that I mean, she might regard that as a great achievement, but what it doesn't help you do is deal with what's going on now with respect to, what do you do about Russia? What do you do about Ukraine? So Macron is I guess, to quote Shakespeare, right? He's kind of had, a certain degree of greatness thrust upon him as being kind of by default the only European statesman who's able to pick up the phone and speak to Putin. Putin will take his calls, right? But it's not clear he would take them from numerous other European heads of government at the current moment.
Certainly. As David Moran has called Macron, but can he deliver any goods? One wonders. Wonders indeed. Now we have today, folks. Thanks for all the comments. A lot of comments here on who is the real nutter in UK politics, be it Bojo or Blair. I don't think we should probably be wading into that one, as we are trying to be a bit more forward-looking at the minute. But John, just in terms of where we're looking at with Germany at the minute, so Ian says Germany currently has 33% of its electricity generated by coal power stations using brown coal, using that dirty lignite, and that has huge particulate emissions alongside the CO2. Does all of this does reveal an awful lot of hypocrisy, I would say.
It does. And again, it just makes you look back at a recent history of German energy policy and wonder, what were these guys thinking? I mean, how much energy Kool-Aid did they drink regarding just how successful wind and solar could reasonably be? I mean, don't get me wrong, they're okay to provide a certain amount of power in certain conditions, but they do not provide reliable base power in most conditions. They really don't. And so, I mean, we've had this discussion before, and I've actually written about this extensively in recent years. Germany's choice basically has been either totally scrap plans to give up some nuclear power capacity and keep existing plants online as long as possible while building new ones, and or take advantage of your very, very substantial coal deposits that you have. Now, yes, lignite is dirty. Fortunately, there are modern scrubbing technologies that make lignite less dirty than it sort of used to be, as it were, in effect. And does that mean it's as clean as anthracite at the end of the day? Again, I'm not an expert in this. I suspect it's difficult to get lignite to be scrubbed and to that degree and still have it be economical, right? To produce a meaningful amount of power. And yet, come on. I mean, this is Germany, right? Germans are pretty good at solving technological problems when it comes to industrial technology. They have an astonishing track record of doing so. And if you had taken some portion of all the geniuses who are working on wind and solar over the past 2 decades and said, "Hey guys, just in case, can we have some of you work on ways to scrub lignite more efficiently? So if we ever do have to fall back on our very substantial coal deposits, we can do so without creating black smog clouds over our major cities." Now, that would have been a prudent thing to do. And not, you wouldn't necessarily know that it would have been necessary, but it probably wasn't done at all. How many brilliant young German academics do you think thought, I'm going to pursue a career in trying to find a way to actually make coal cleaner into the future? Were there any grants for that? Was there any support for that? Was anyone who said they were writing their PhD dissertation on that topic, would he or she ever get a date? I mean, seriously, right? So this is kind of where we've ended up, and I think it's very irresponsible for Germany to have done what it's done.
Yeah, I would agree. You certainly wouldn't be very popular. I don't know. Maybe it could help you get a date, though. I mean, I think that would give you a pretty strong bad boy image if you're working in the coal industry. I think maybe some people would be into that. But yeah, it does feel like I mean, just getting a PhD on that. I mean, do you think a university would even be interested in supporting that?
Well,
I
again, this is the point. We've come so far, right? We've come so far in pursuing stuff that has yet to be proven practical, economical, and efficient. We've strayed so far from what we know works that it's only natural that you have to fall back on it at some point, but you're less able to fall back on it. And indeed, perhaps you could have advanced it in some way in the meantime. Something I talk about a lot is recycling technology, which I think is wonderful, by the way. Why
Yep.
shouldn't we recycle what we use? Um, Now, this is something that actually works, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff you can actually recycle for acceptable cost. And so, that's an example of, okay, good. It's great that we've learned how to do that. That's terrific. But the fact is, not every green initiative, no matter how high-minded, no matter how great it sounds on paper, truly works out in the end, and you should hedge your bets.
Yeah, certainly. We have a very good question here from Vim that I think we should discuss here. This is, yeah, I think this is a very good question indeed. Once the strikes have started, can we expect interest rate cuts and quantitative easing coming back? So, yeah, I think it's a great question. John, feel free to just take it away because there's so many angles to that, which have huge implications for the future value of the currency.
Oh God, yeah, 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 yeah. No, no. Look, I think that this tightening cycle, I think, is going to be very, very brief. I just think economies are too fragile, and so look, policymakers have to be seen to be doing something, and indeed they are. But it's just not going to last. It's just not going to last. And so, if you take a look at relative expectations in the market right now for what central banks are going to be able to do, how tight they're going to be able to make policy, I would be very, very surprised if indeed they can follow through to the extent that people think they probably can. And you're absolutely right that at the moment you see any sort of reversal anywhere, the currency in question could get hit and get hit hard. And yes, this includes the dollar itself, which I think is almost the poster child for the major currency anyway, that is due a substantial reassessment when people realize just how quickly the US economy is collapsing. If you look at the mortgage market data, it's appalling. Okay. It's really bad. And we know how a sharp decline in US housing market activity, we know what that resulted in 2007 and into 2008, right? So if that's happening again and the central bank is tightening, that can't last very long.
No. And I can imagine them doing it, John. Bank of England, 9% inflation. You know what we need? A nice interest rate cut and back to quantitative easing. I can
Look,
really believe it.
no, but it won't take long until we get there. Seriously, if the housing market here weakens enough, really, which I mean, and it does appear to be weakening, but not. I haven't. The data I've seen suggests it's not weakening nearly as fast as the market in the U.S. is, for whatever reason, right? For whatever reason, there are lots of things that go into this. So we're a little bit behind in that, it would appear. But the same sort of policy mix and effects thereof and whatnot that I just explained with respect to the Fed's situation would apply to the UK. It's just that the US is in the unique situation of having a super strong currency with a sharply weakening housing market, whereas the sterling has not been strong, but the housing market has sort of been holding up. But they're going to end up in the same place, in my opinion.
Yeah, which is not a good place to be.
No.
We've got to take our victories. I guess we're now beating the Americans on the inflation side, 9%. I mean, come on, John. Where's the strength here? You gotta up your game. Got to debase the currency faster.
Uh-huh.
Load of debt. Got to get rid of it. But yeah, not a happy position to be in, especially when you consider well, like we were discussing earlier, the industrial action that this is going to produce, which is going to make, in turn, things worse for everybody. So, although of course, I don't think you can blame anyone who's considering this kind of policy, given the cost of living squeeze. It's just it's quite remarkable to see Boris Johnson saying nobody should be asking for higher wages, given 9% inflation. That's a product of the UK government.
Again, politically, it's very hard when inflation is this high. It's very, very high. I mean, look, let's theoretically, when an economy grows, and let's say it's growing in just nominal terms, if you want, so you can take real growth as well as whatever is inflationary. There's got to be some split in that does go to the workers, right? There's got to be some of it must accrue to the workers. That is, if workers' real incomes are not increasing at all, and yet there's any real growth at all, that's unfair. That means that all the benefit, 100% of the benefit of any growth in the economy goes to the owners of capital, the wealthy, right? That's just not fair. I mean, seriously, if you're already wealthy, getting 100% of the growth,
yeah.
Come on. I mean, that's not the way. That's not the way a democratic country that is somewhat capitalist, believes in the work ethic, blah blah blah. It's not the way it's supposed to work. And so there's got to be some split. The question then becomes, what should that split be? To what extent should the benefits of growth accrue to labor in the form of higher real incomes? And to what extent should the capitalists who are providing the capital stock, who own most of it, they've got to get their coupon too, right? That's the way capitalism works. In Germany, it's very interesting because when they have negotiations in Germany between the labor unions and the corporations, they actually have this sort of discussion. They say, okay, look, this is profitability. This is what we're actually getting. And if you ask for this big a wage increase, you're getting a historically disproportionate share of the overall pie. And it's an interesting process whereby it kind of helps to keep German labor unions in check. They know they're getting a slice of the pie, but they understand they're not allowed to get the whole pie. And the capitalists know that they've got to share a substantial portion of the pie with their labor unions. Otherwise, it's just not fair. Germans are much more open about just the debate in this way. Whereas in the UK, it seems to descend immediately into politics. Oh, you're anti-labor. Oh, you're anti-capitalist. That's not helpful.
Yeah, we've never been that good about talking about money in this country. So my guess would be a sort of an offshoot of that. Some great comments here in the chat as ever, folks. Apple says, hello, Boaz and John. Hello, Apple. Good to see you this evening. The other week in Freiburg, I noticed that a large good quality clothes shop typical for solid middle class Germany had closed, which is a sad reflection of the current situation. It is indeed. And we do get another comment from Northumberland who says he's surprised that the German people are accepting inflation so meekly. Well, early days, Northumberland, early days. Things could really go wrong there. I do have a question from Robert. Is that a Ukraine ribbon cloth bangle? No, it is not, Robert. These are QR codes to get into the hacker house. They won't let you leave or go back unless you're wearing one. That's what these are. So unless the Ukrainians change their flag to bright purple, no. Now, in terms of, there's one last headline I'd like us to discuss, John, before we do a few more questions here. And this one is regarding the poster boy for tech and the bull market now, Elon Musk, regarding Starlink. Elon Musk's Starlink aid to Ukraine triggers scrutiny in China over US military links. So the bit of context for the story is that Elon Musk's SpaceX venture, very big in satellite communications now, has provided a fair bit of aid to Ukraine. And in doing so, has angered the Chinese because, of course, they're not pro-Ukraine, and of course they have a lot of debts with the Russians. They want to ensure that they have an amicable relationship, and in doing so, the Chinese are now putting a bit of pressure on Elon Musk. And of course, Elon Musk has an awful lot of interest in China, which makes it a very interesting situation. What do you make of this? Do you think it may lead to something? Lead to some greater fallout for Musk's ambitions?
Well, and not just Musk. You can broaden it to include a lot of the tech generally, and a lot of U.S. Firms' activities that take place at least partially in China. And this is the thing. This is a real problem, because when things get political like this, you can definitely see, this is another fracture of at the global level. And so, I mean, look at Hollywood. I mean, when Hollywood makes films now, I mean, they take Chinese sensitivities into account, because they know that they want to be able to translate and distribute their films into China, because it's a huge market now for that. It didn't used to be, but it is today. And so, Hollywood's been doing it. Tech firms in general have got to be sensitive about it. This is just the latest headline, and something which has kind of become pretty normal. Only, of course, now that the war's kicked off in Ukraine, and China's trying to stay neutral and doesn't want, I mean, and to the extent it doesn't want to give any unfair advantage to Ukraine in this conflict. And sure enough, Musk has this technology that might have military significance. So there you go. You can see why it's come to this, in my opinion. And this, but this is the thing, right? In theory, globalization is so great, because it takes advantage of labor and capital and trade and whatnot all over the world, and there are tremendous efficiencies you can squeeze out of it. But the problem is, when you do have some fundamental political, geopolitical, conflict brewing somewhere, it suddenly threatens all these supply lines. It's not just about energy pipelines into Europe from Russia. There's so many other things here that could be affected by it, especially if it escalates further, especially if it's prolonged. And some of these could have severe economic consequences, not just for corporate profits, but trickling all the way down to the consumer, who finds that a number of products that they consider to be just staple products are actually somewhat dependent on who knows what process in China for chemicals, for
Yep.
who knows what basic something it might be that's essential for the widget they've grown so accustomed to, right? It doesn't have to be an iPhone. It can be something really basic. So, we're going to learn this the hard way if we don't resolve this conflict somehow sooner rather than later.
Certainly, certainly. I wonder what I mean, I think this is maybe I say, well, as you said, we've already seen plenty of warning signs with Hollywood and tech companies stepping around on eggshells around China and, of course, Taiwan. I wonder if this in particular, with Starlink and Musk, may lead to something more significant. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Probably a sign of the times more than anything else. We do get a question over from our LinkedIn stream from Nikki, who asks, Germany might have covered their positions if they had created an LNG storage hub a few years back. Do you agree? Now, as far as I'm aware, they have started actually finally building one of those, if I've read the headlines correctly. John, do you think how much of the current situation in Germany and in Europe as a whole would have been solved had Germany done this a little while ago?
I think it certainly would have been solved for the short term. I'm not sure that LNG is a good long-term solution for Europe's energy needs. The LNG supply chain has lots of potential points of failure in it. And I'm not sure that longer term that's any more geopolitically stable than a degree of dependence on Russian gas. We know where LNG comes from, right? It does not exactly come from the most stable part of the world. That is, a lot of it comes from the Middle East. And so you need to be careful about your dependence on that region also, if you ask me. So I mean, if I were advising Germany, I would say be flexible. Sure, go ahead and increase LNG capacity, but also try to find a way to develop your energy infrastructure with respect to Russia, which of course requires that you do find a way forward politically, diplomatically at some point. So, try to find a solution there. But yes, LNG in the short term, sure, if they had more capacity, that would be a huge help. As I understand now, the Rotterdam facility pretty much doesn't have any spare capacity for bringing LNG in. And so if Germany had added a port which had comparable to capacity to Rotterdam, that would have made a huge difference, I'm sure, in helping them work their way through this currently very challenging situation.
Colin asks, wouldn't the greatest supply side reform to ease the current issues with inflation be unilaterally lifting sanctions? Now, Colin, that sounds like pro-Putin sentiment right there. Be very careful with that kind of comment. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to find fault with it. If you're thinking of supply side reform, I mean, what would be the easiest way of doing it? I would probably say lifting all sanctions would probably be the first place to start. John, am I thinking of it in the wrong way?
Well, I mean, sure. I mean, right. It is a supply shock throwing up sanctions for anything in principle, right? But obviously, when you put them on the most basic inputs to an economy, such as energy and other commodities, then yeah, it's a huge negative supply shock, and we're seeing the effects of that. I mean, don't get me wrong. We had seen negative supply shocks prior related to COVID and various other things. I mean, modern Europe has a long history of self-inflicted negative supply shocks with respect to all manner of things: labor market regulations, like licensing laws, um, high and in some cases very complex tax codes with very high compliance costs. I mean, Europe's been doing this to itself for a long time. I mean, you could
Yep.
argue that when it comes to trying to improve the supply situation in Europe, really the whole continent has this masochistic tendency, which is chronic, and it's sad, right? It's kind of sad to see. But you're right. A quick wave of the magic wand, removing all sanctions, for all of its political impossibility, given the situation on the ground right now, would be a very big relief, for sure.
Yeah, certainly. Lemonade 22 asks, why are the German people not rioting? Catastrophic Russian sanctions that the US forced on Europe have been devastating for the European people. Well, yeah, John, you're the Germany hand here. I mean, my gut reaction to that would be, well, the inflation really does keep going up and up. You are going to see a lot of angry Germans, just as we referred to earlier. But at the same time, the manner in which the sanctions are viewed is seen as an almost patriotic thing by, I think, a substantial portion of the population. We have to take this hit in order for freedom and democracy to live on in Ukraine. Am I thinking about that in the right way?
Probably, but I actually think the German public is not as unified behind that
Yeah,
point of view
yeah, it's just the
as
press.
some of the headlines you read in the papers might suggest.
Yep.
It might be something like 60-40. And the percent swing that you'd have to get in there could indeed occur over a 1 year period, 2 year period, if indeed inflation remains elevated, if unemployment starts to rise, and so on and so forth. Now that said, I mean, I look, it's highly unusual for prosperous, otherwise politically stable countries to suddenly turn to riots. I would certainly expect German populism to rise first and be seen at the ballot box, the way you're seeing it in France, the way you're seeing it in Italy, the way you're seeing it in a handful of other European countries. Yes, you're seeing it in Germany, but the scale is so much smaller, and the modern wave of populism really only showed up in Germany about 5 or 6 years ago, right? It's very, very young. Now that said, it is growing. It's absolutely growing, and it would grow faster if this current set of conditions remains in place. But Germans aren't going to suddenly riot. They're going to try to change things at the ballot box first. If they feel for whatever reason the ballot box is unresponsive to soaring inflation, rising unemployment, so on and so forth, then okay, look, any country beyond a certain point, no matter how prosperous, if they feel that they're actually things are getting so much worse and they're not getting any response from their political elite, yeah, beyond a certain point, anyone's going to riot, right? So, but we're
Yeah.
nowhere near that.
I wonder if food riots are going to be on the table, even in Western Europe. I wonder if that might throw some accelerant into the mix, because ultimately, while not being heard by the elites does drive some people to riot eventually, I think it's much faster when people can't get fuel or they can't get food.
Well, look, if I mean, if it gets to the point where Italians can't afford their pasta and the Spanish can't afford their paella and whatnot, then all hell breaks loose. Again, I think we're a long way from that. But hey, if this goes on long enough, if you go through a couple growing seasons and you don't solve your energy problem, the combined impact on food and energy is going to take a substantial portion of the middle class and make them feel more impoverished than their grandparents ever were. And psychologically, human beings find things like that extremely hard to accept for any reason, right?
Yep.
I mean, I don't think it's going to come to that, but if it does, you're going to see. I mean, again, revolution's a big word, but it's going to start. It's going to start to look like something historically big is brewing in Europe if they don't get themselves out of the situation at some point.
Yeah, big time. Regarding the LNG hub in Germany, Nikki followed up with the USA are a big supplier of LNG too, and there's also a hub in Spain. It's one of the interesting sides to this. As we were talking about European strategic autonomy earlier, I think what's really happening beneath the surface to some degree is actually Europe is going to become more dependent on America. So everyone in Europe's been saying, we're going to go do our own thing. But with LNG coming from the States, I think we could end up with a much more European, American influenced Europe as a product of all of this energy. Because while Russia is close by, politics being what they are, I can't imagine America just hoovering up an awful lot of energy business. Colin, regarding wouldn't cutting all the sanctions be the best supply side reform that you could make? Says, I was anti-lockdown too. That didn't make me pro-virus. I agree, Colin. I agree. Just making fun of how quick to anger a lot of people are when you say anything that isn't we must put more and more pressure on Russia is you must be a Putin shill. Now, we are getting on a little bit for time here, folks. And from Apple in Freiburg. I agree, lack of food is hard to stomach. From what I've seen of the German police during COVID protests, they look fierce, all dressed in black and not respectful of the elderly protesters. A lot of the lockdown protests and how they're met by police in places like the Netherlands as well. It did make you think: is this really the free world that we're in? But of course, things were worse in other countries as well. And another question from Jay Burgess: do governments want information with a thinking face? Well, Jay, don't tell anyone, but some of them really do. Or at least, we talk about governments as though they're one guy, but inside governments, inside Treasury departments, before the lockdown, before Wu flu, everyone was worried about all of this debt that was building up. How are we going to deal with it all? And 9% inflation, that's going to get rid of a lot of debt pretty quickly. So there are certainly a lot of celebrations secretly in central banks and treasuries, I believe, regarding these high inflation rates. And I think it would definitely explain why a lot of central banks are saying, we're not going to hike interest rates. We're not going to bring down inflation because we're afraid of financial instability. It's going to cause a big shock, when really it's like, actually, we kind of want this rate to stay high and burn away all of this debt that we were so worried about for about a decade. Am I thinking of this the wrong way, John?
No. Look, this is a form of financial repression, and the challenge for politicians is, given the way you describe it, and I roughly agree that's what's going on. The challenge for politicians is to try and stretch this out as long as they can. So, look, everyone's well aware of the historically high debt burdens. Everyone's well aware that inflation will help to erode it. But everyone's also aware that inflation can become a very serious political problem. And so it's a balancing act. And it's a very difficult balancing act. It's hard to transfer wealth from one place to another without people realizing. And when they realize, it's hard to say, but we didn't see it coming, or this is somehow necessary because of this war somewhere, or whatever. That's very difficult to do, but they're certainly going to give it a go. So when you say they're celebrating, I wouldn't go quite that far. What I would say is that it would be okay. We have a job to do here, and in keeping with the script, we've just got to keep going. And so I'm not sure. I think celebrate would be the word they would use if they actually managed to remain in power throughout this process without at some point, being sort of, thrown out by some sort of, popular uprising of some kind, saying to hell with this. We want someone to come into power who's going to, deal fundamentally with the causes of the inflation rather than just try to assuage it politically and, whatever it is. So that's when you'll get the big celebration. when they manage to pull it off and retire, or when they retire with having been so successful for so long that they have all kinds of other secondary jobs lined up afterwards, as politicians sometimes do these days. I guess they might be high-fiving whoever their benefactors are.
Yeah, quite. I think amongst certain central bank policymakers, certain treasury officials, I reckon they were cracking out the champers, maybe bringing out a Jeroboam or two of
Already?
Bordeaux. Yeah. Well, if you're not elected, it's you're just civil servant or whatever. Hard to fire. Won't lead to you losing your job. I reckon so, but that's just me. Anyway.
Okay.
We do get one question from Gerard that I think we'll have to save for the next one. But Gerard, I have seen it, and we shall address it in the next episode. I keep hearing that the US is exporting its own inflation. What exactly does that mean, and how is the US doing it? Very, very good question indeed, Gerard. The US is indeed exporting its own inflation, but they managed to get away with it. We shall address that in the next episode, where we shall cover that in a lot more depth, because it dives a lot deeper into the entire dollar bear story and the dollar bull story as well. That's all for this week, folks. Thank you all so much for tuning in. It has been a great episode as ever. John, thanks so much.
Oh, my pleasure, Boaz. Until next time.
Until next time, folks, we'll be back with episode 50 next week. That's all from us for the moment. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.